Welcome to Pivot Points, a new series featuring some of the world's most successful women, candidly sharing their stories and insights about how they made it to the top and how you can too. Hosted by Perry Yeatman, a straight-talking global executive and award-winning author who created the career and life of her dreams and now wants to help other ambitious women do the same.
Welcome. I'm Perry Yeatman, host of Pivot Points. This special edition of the series is a compilation of some of my favorite stories about how successful women got their careers off the ground. It's specifically designed for those looking to land that first professional job or still in the early stages of their career. What you'll hear in these 9 short segments makes it clear that it isn't always smooth sailing at the beginning, and that a rough start doesn't necessarily mean a stymied career trajectory. I hope these stories inspire and entertain you as much as they did me. The first story is from Elise Glink. She is a TV and radio personality and a syndicated columnist and an author of more than a dozen books. And she launched her career by getting fired.
The thing that really launched me was not getting a job, but getting fired from a job.
Okay, well, that is an unusual way to get launched. Tell me about that.
So I get out of college with my English degree in hand and no job prospects, right? And so I get a job working for a really not so great guy in the real estate world. And I was kind of an office manager for a commercial real estate firm. I just couldn't imagine anything worse. I mean, today the building that I was in has been turned into a garage. And I'm sitting at the front desk and I'm supposedly hired as an associate, just like the guy. But this guy, who's a half a year older than me, has an office. And basically I'm a secretary. And I find out he's making $500 more a year than I am. And I think he was 18.5 and I was 18. And when I asked about that, I was told that he's a guy and he makes more and you know, the usual kind of baloney that you hear. And I just went bananas. And then they started treating me horribly. The guy who owned the company, who I can't name for obvious reasons, he started using all kinds of horrible words. Like he would call me a C word, and then he would call me a B word, and then he would call
stuff that really did happen when we were starting out, which would never be allowed to happen now.
I just couldn't take it anymore. And so after 4 months, I hired an attorney who was actually the mom of a classmate of mine who lived in our building. And my mother was like, you know, if you quit this job, you're never going to get another job. And I was like, I don't really care. So I got out of that. And then the next job I had, I was doing freelance PR. And then I got a job I really loved where I was the kind of editorial assistant for a publishing company in Chicago. And I realized I absolutely loved publishing and loved writing books. And I did really, really well. On my first year anniversary, I wore my new suit and I went into the office because I was supposed to have my review and I got fired. I was like, why are you firing me? I've bought all these books. I'm the first one here. I'm the last one out. Like, why are you firing me? And this woman looked at me and said, my boss, and she said, you're not meant to be here. You're really too big for this company, like your personality. And I just didn't even know what to say. I left there. I was in tears. My boyfriend, soon-to-be husband, left his office to come to meet me. And I would have panic attacks for years going by that office. It was awful. And I decided then and there I was never, ever, ever going to work for anybody else. I had taken a pay cut from my lofty $18,000 a year salary to $14,000 and had gotten a raise halfway through. And I got fired and I went home and my mother said to me, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I can do almost anything and earn $15,000 a year. So I can wait tables. I can, go be a screenwriter in Hollywood. Like there's a million things I can do if I only have to make $15,000 a year. And that launched me. That was the decision at that moment that I could not be fired by anybody else and I would stand on my own 2 feet. God knows what that would bring.
Wow. Next up is Pernilla Spears Lopez. She also failed her way into a successful career in retail, actually becoming the first woman to run IKEA North America.
My first failure was actually, I went to school to be a journalist and in Denmark. And after about a year as a freelance journalist, not being able to really get good jobs right off, I was very young compared to everybody else and pretty inexperienced. So after a year of being a freelance journalist in Denmark, I realized that I had to just say, maybe there's something else in life for me than this, or at least not now. So I actually decided to leave journalism, and I'd always wanted to travel and possibly live somewhere outside the Denmark. And I had some connections with the U.S., and I was very interested in design and home furnishings. So I actually thought of starting a company together with a friend, and we started a company that ended up exporting Danish design to the U.S. My job was to go to the U.S. and import it and wholesale it in the U.S. And that is really how I landed in the U.S. I started out in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with a small import company, and that I did for about 2 years. I was, at that point, you could say I was inexperienced and didn't do as good of a job in research as people are doing today as they start their first company. And so after 2.5 years, I had worked very hard, drove 60,000 miles all around Florida, and I realized it was time to probably give it up. I had really some great new clients, and there was some stuff that was happening to move, but I was out of money, out of energy, out of confidence, and I kind of said, it's time to let that go. So after a couple of failures, and along the way I had met this guy, John Guarino, who was head of a small, actually it was a pretty big furniture company in Florida, and he had asked me if I ever wanted to have a real job, if I would contact him. And so that was a perfect time for me to remember to call him because I needed a real job. And that was really, in a lot of ways, the beginning of a 30-year career within home furnishings and retail. And it was a $5 an hour sales job on the floor. Don't ever be afraid of starting at the bottom, and don't be a job snob.
Our third segment is from Irene Rosenfeld. Today, she is the chairman and CEO of Mondelez International. But the story she's going to share was from early on in her career at Kraft, when, even though it wasn't open, over a routine check-in, she mentioned that she might want to run Kraft Canada, and that ended up making all the difference.
I think for my career, the opportunity to run Kraft Canada fairly early on in my career was a really important launching ground. And it was important for a couple of reasons. One is that it was the first time that I had an entirely freestanding business to run. It was in another country, and so I had some of the cultural dynamics to deal with. And it was the opportunity to really manage our whole portfolio of products. Up until that time, I had been in charge of one or two or a small portfolio. This was now the entire portfolio of Kraft. And I think about that opportunity a lot because I actually think if I had not raised my hand, I'm not sure it would have come my way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think one of my very most important pieces of advice that I give to folks as they're moving along in their career is to ask for what you want, to know what you want, and then be prepared to ask for it. In my case, I happen to have been at a dinner, just a routine dinner, check-in dinner with my boss at the time, and he asked me the usual question, if you could have any job, what would you want? And at that point, there were really only two jobs. At that moment, I was running the desserts business for General Foods. I had run the beverage division prior to that. And at that point, there were really only two jobs that were of any interest to me. One was Oscar Mayer, and the other was Kraft Canada. And my interest in both of those was because they were fully integrated businesses that had their own sales force and all their own functional resources. And that would have been a different experience relative to what I had been doing, not to mention that they both had a very broad portfolio of products. And so I mentioned those two opportunities to my boss, knowing full well that those were not available. They were both run by very talented leaders at that time. And unbeknownst to me, the Kraft Canada job was about to open up. And so within 2 weeks' time, I got a call asking me if I would consider Kraft Canada. In fact, I was told that there really was a sense that I might not be willing to move. And so had I not mentioned it, I'm not even sure I would have been on the short list. And as I said, it was, for me, a giant step up in terms of responsibility, in terms of perspective. And it really, I think, was one of the most culminating experiences that I had up until then. And I would say has withstood the test of time.
Our fourth story comes from Sally Blount. She started at BCG. And I have to tell you, she said she didn't even really like it. But boy, was she glad she did it, because it really launched her career.
20s is a time to begin to become an adult and to learn what the world of work is about and how you can have true impact in that world. And because you're still in an exploring phase and there's no way you can yet know what your unique gifts in the work world are because you've never been there, right? And the process of going to college is not the same as working. I think you've got to go for hard jobs. And you and I have talked about how way too often the data shows over and over again, women are not taking the more aggressive jobs. They're not taking the more competitive business and legal jobs. And what I did, my first job out, I have to be honest with you, I didn't like it, but boy, am I thrilled I did it. I worked for the Boston Consulting Group, and I was an associate in highbrow management consulting. I traveled a lot. I worked on corporate strategy for Fortune 500 companies. I was up all night. I had a sort of crisis of meaning once when I was in the middle of the night working at the office. I remember saying, I really don't care if this company grows its market share by 5% at all, right? But clearly I'm being paid to care. I can't do this in the long run. And that's what began to give me insights about what motivated me. But I learned how to slice and dice a business in that first job. I learned how to construct a supply curve within an industry. And it made me a much stronger thinker. It made me understand how businesses go together and how competitive strategy within an industry works. And so I am a whole lot smarter because I was imprinted by BCG. So I'm indebted to them forever.
Next is Connie Lindsay. Connie launched her career via a sales job, despite absolutely positively not wanting to be a salesperson. And that decision helped her become one of the top executives at Northern Trust.
The first job that launched me was becoming the head of sales for Treasury Management Marketing at Northern Trust, the firm that I work for now. I joined Northern from Ameritech Corporation and really was thinking about what my career would look like. I wasn't chasing a position or a title, but how could I grow more as a leader and a person that would add additional value to the business? And my mentor at that time said to me, in order to really move forward, you're going to need to manage a sales team. Mm-hmm. Well, there were three things that I was certain of in life. One was that I didn't want to be a salesperson because I had come from a finance background. Two was I didn't want to be a salesperson because I had come from a finance background. And three was I didn't want to be a salesperson. Needless to say, through his coaching and encouragement, and quite frankly saying, in order to get your ticket punched in this organization, it's important that you have great alacrity and skill with clients. But the most important thing that he said to me, Perry, was, and I believe you can do it. I believe you can do it. Now, I was coming into to manage a sales team. I'd not been a salesperson. I had done product management work and certainly had done the kinds of things on the non-client-facing side of the work. But the words, I believe you can do it, not only did he say I can believe you can do it, but he really provided the kind of air cover that when I needed advice and counsel, I could go to him without fear of judgment or retribution or something that would make me believe that I was lacking. Now, the 15 people reporting to me didn't have a lot of confidence because they felt here we're getting a person who really is more of a numbers person. She's not the sales product kind of individual. So it was proving to them that I could lead, articulate a vision, have the kind of financial acumen that would allow us to grow the business, and quite frankly, with good listening skills and good ability to ask questions, to learn the business, but also provide value for them. And so I tried to find out what was the biggest challenge that that group had at that time. And the biggest challenge that they articulated was that they didn't have enough computers. So I negotiated with the president of the business unit to get those computers and laptops so that as they traveled, they had access to technology. And then it was on from there. We exceeded our sales goal. I became ever more comfortable in the work that I did and actually was then promoted from that role to senior vice president.
And from then on, you didn't just say the three things I know are I'm not going to be in sales.
And from then on, it became selling is critically important. It challenges us in ways that and caused me to go deep inside of my reservoir of skills and techniques. It honed my listening skills to a point where I'm able to discern what a cause and effect can be, what questions people are considering, and listening more than we speak, so that I'm able then to be present with people, and they know and sense that presence, and it creates a level of authenticity and comfort on the part of the other individual, and that really has been the greatest benefit from that experience.
Deanie Elsner, who currently runs a $4 billion business for Kellogg, actually launched her career at another iconic CPG brand, Procter & Gamble. And she talks about the importance of getting that first credential.
The one that launched me is I started my career with Procter & Gamble right out of undergrad. I went to undergrad at the University of Arizona over in Tucson, and I double majored. I had a major in marketing and general business. As I came out of Arizona, I knew marketing was ultimately what I wanted to do, but it was hard to break into marketing without an MBA. So the next best thing was to go into sales with Procter. I was hired, and months after I graduated, I started in sales with Procter & Gamble in Northern California. I was there for about 3.5 years, and at that point, my dad had fallen ill, and I came back and helped him run his business. But those 3.5 years for me were the launch years, because I joined a company that to this day is an iconic company known for its reputation in training good general managers, really fundamental skills, and a leader in the marketplace. And then I was surrounded by professionals. And so, as a kid coming out of undergrad, you don't really know how to act. You don't really know how to be this grown up. And I learned a lot from the people that I was both reporting to and the people that I was surrounded by. My first manager there was Bill Kavanaugh, and he took a personal interest in helping me develop. And to this day, I would contend that sales experience is still experience I utilize as I present to Wall Street, whether I present to the board or internally to senior meetings. It is knowing how to think on my feet, knowing how to react to difficult situations, and knowing how to make the close to a sale is ultimately what I continue to draw on.
Betty Hudson, who rose to become the CCO for National Geographic, actually talked her way out of a dress shop and into radio promotion.
I got a job in a dress shop, and I told absolutely everybody I checked out of the dress shop or sat next to at a dinner party that I was actually an advertising copywriter, and I was miscast as Miss Unbalanced Drawer at the dress shop. And eventually a guy said, okay, come in and produce a commercial for my client. He worked in sales for the local CBS affiliate. And he said, come in and do one, and let's see whether you really can get this done. So I did. It was for eggs. I can remember it to this day. For a grocery store that dealt in farm fresh produce, and I did a commercial for eggs. That led me to a production job in local TV in Charleston, South Carolina, where there were no unions and no barriers and not much money, but endless opportunity. If you were willing to put the hours in, they had more work than they had teams to do, and you could run camera, you could learn to run an audio board, you could go out and take your own picture, you could do everything. So that was my first doorway in.
Charlene Wheelis, who is currently the CCO for Bechtel, actually fell into her career in communications when she left IBM because despite being a highly sought-after position, it felt like a fate worse than death to her. And she knew it just wasn't right for her.
Right out of college, I joined IBM, and I think what would be considered today as a postgraduate internship. And so I came out to the Washington, D.C. area to work for IBM, and probably about 6 or 7 months into my time there, it's this wonderful company. It's this huge company. Everybody aspires to work at IBM. And I'm thinking to myself, with all of my 22-year-old wisdom, gosh, I could never work here. And I'd look around, and I would look around, and those were the days where everybody in IBM had on a blue suit, a white shirt and a blue tie. And if there was a red tie in the room, people would say, well, who's the clown? So everybody had their unofficial uniform, men and women. And I would look around and I'd say to myself, gosh, these people are really successful, but they could never work anywhere else. They've only been taught how to work at IBM. And for some reason, for me at 22 years old, that just sounded like a fate worse than death. So I could not get out of there fast enough. And, of course, my friends are saying to me, you work at IBM and you're going to walk away from that?
Yeah,
I was like, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like there is nothing about me that's clone-like, and I'm not going to start now. So I would say that job launched me into an environment that so many people wanted that I knew I absolutely did not want. So I spent the next couple of years, quite frankly, bouncing around a bit. I'd have one job for 1 year, another job for another year, and I learned early on that if I worked at an association, I'd be overworked and underpaid, but I'd learn a heck of a lot. Mm-hmm. So I worked for the Automotive Dismantlers and Recyclers Association for 2 years.
Never even heard of it. Okay, you go.
Right. Which is really just a nice way of saying junkyard dealers.
Oh, gosh.
And that taught me so much, not the least of which, if I ever need to get a full-size car crusher into a convention center, I know how to do that. And someday that skill might be helpful. But I was able to, in that job, I was able to really focus in on what I liked about a communications career and what I did well and what I didn't do so well or what I didn't like. And I ultimately landed at a company called DynCorp, which is not in existence today, but it was a mid-size, a few $1 billion in annual revenue company. Had been around for nearly 50 years. It was in the defense industry, and it was big but not too big, and it had some of the great attributes of IBM in being a large company, but it wasn't so buttoned up and rigid. Mm-hmm. And so there I was able to join their team, their communications team, and really cut my teeth in different areas of communications. And I would say that is where I really started to launch my career. And I ultimately spent 10 years at DynCorp, and in that job, in that company, was the first time I was promoted to a vice president and made a corporate officer. So it became a pretty significant job for me.
And finally, you'll hear about my story, Perry Yeatman. I actually kind of had two launching points. First, by starting at the very bottom in a small firm and doing everything from getting the coffee to writing the checks. And then by going overseas to a place I knew almost nothing about and with almost no notice. The first one was my first professional job, my first job that was a full-time job in the career field that I had chosen, which was communication. And I landed this one, I got out of college. I was a lit major, right? So my dad and I frequently talked about how, what was I going to do to support myself? Yep. And I had made a deal with myself that by the end of the summer, one way or the other, I was going to land a job in my career field. And so I basically sent out resumes to every PR, marketing communications agency in the country trying to land a job. And about halfway through August, I got a reply that was positive, and it was from a guy who was actually starting a firm. So I was going to be the second hire behind the CEO. Okay. And I thought, I wasn't sure about this because I thought maybe go to a big brand name first or whatever. But I'll tell you, the reason this was such an important decision to go with that teeny firm was because I actually learned not just about how to be a consultant in communication, but actually how to run a business. Because when I showed up being the second employee, I was the chief bottle washer. I made the coffee. I answered the phones. I was the secretary, but I also did the bills and the invoicing. And I got to go to client meetings with a level of client that I never would have gotten to go to had I joined a huge firm. So it turned out to be a really important moment for me because I hadn't studied business. So I really got to see from the inside out how to run a business in my very first job. And I won't tell you that it was glamorous. I did so much stuff that wasn't glamorous, but it was a fabulous learning opportunity. The second kind of launch to my career, since I think what really ultimately differentiated me in my profession was my overseas experience. And that came a few years later when I went to Singapore. And you have to understand, when I left this small firm, I had always had this dream since I was about 13 that I wanted to live in Europe. And so after I got my first few years under my belt, I started looking around, realizing that this small firm, even though we had grown, we were never going to be a global firm in time for me to get a global career. And so I started looking around, and I basically, again, sent out resumes to kind of every one of the major global firms in America. And one of them wrote back to me and said, if you'll give us 2 years in the market of our choice in America, we'll send you overseas. And so I said, okay, I'll make that deal. I did my 2 years. I worked very hard. I got measured on client satisfaction and on business development and all sorts of things. And I kept marketing myself. Every quarter, I wrote back to the head of North America and reminded him, I'm here, I'm doing my job, and I can't wait to go to Europe.
I have to know, Perry, what was the market they put you in?
It was Singapore. It was absolutely classic because I had planned for Europe. We planned for, and they ultimately called and said, Germany. We think it's going to be Bonn, Germany. I said, okay, I'll start studying German. And about a couple months later, because the wall had come down, everybody thought Germany be booming. What it actually, when they finally called, he said, I know it's not what we promised, but it's really a great opportunity. And the manager there is fabulous. You're going to love her. We really need you to go to Singapore. And I knew about 3 things about Singapore at that time. I came from a small town in Pennsylvania. We all had grown up in that town for, hundreds of years. I was not a worldly person, shall we say, about Asia. And I knew 3 things. I knew that it was going to be hot. As a curly-headed person, I thought I'm going to have a bad hair day every day. And I also thought, as somebody who was about 5'9" at the time, I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be the tallest woman in the country. So it really wasn't sounding all that good. But in the end, I did actually take that job. On the 3rd call, it just set me off because now I was overseas at 25 in a market where I was actually dealing with the head of Asia Pacific for Citibank. And when John Reed came out to Asia, I actually got to work with him as a client. That would never have happened. In New York, I wouldn't have seen John Reed or the head of a region for a decade. And yet I got to do that work hands-on in Asia. So I really think it's those 2 things that made a difference. And on the surface, neither one of them was something I wanted, but they turned out to be the best opportunities I could have had.
You've been listening to Pivot Points, a series designed to help ambitious women have the careers and lives of their dreams. To hear more interviews, go to www.yourcareeryourterms.com. And be sure to tell us what you think. If there are topics you'd like covered or people you'd like interviewed, please let us know. We're here